Why did the strongest humans who ever lived simply vanish? For more than a century, we told ourselves a comforting story about them. We called them brutes, stupid, slow, the dim, shuffling cavemen of the cartoons, an evolutionary dead end, a rough first draft of humanity that nature crumpled up and threw away so that we, the clever ones, could take over. Almost none of that is true. The Neanderthals ruled the harshest corners of the earth for far longer than our own kind has even existed. They were not born in some paradise. They were forged in ice, in a world of 6-month nights and monsters that weighed as much as a truck. Pound for pound, they may have been the strongest, toughest human beings who ever drew breath. And their brains were not smaller than ours. On average, they were bigger. So here is the question that should stop you cold. If they were stronger than us, and their brains were larger than ours, why are we the ones sitting here telling this story, and they are the ones who ended up as fossils in the ground? The answer is stranger and far more human than any tale of clubs and grunting. To understand how they disappeared, we first have to understand how they lived, and we have to swallow something uncomfortable before we even begin. In many of the ways that matter most, they were better at being human than we are. To find where these titans came from, we have to turn the clock all the way back. To find where these titans came from, we have to go back, deep back, somewhere around 400,000 years, give or take. Picture a fork in the human story, a genetic crossroads. On one side, a group of early humans stays in Africa under the burning sun. Those are our ancestors, our grandparents, many thousands of times removed. But another group turned and did something bold and reckless and world-changing. They marched north, into the unknown, into a land no human had ever managed to hold. And when they walked into Europe and Asia, they found a hostile world waiting for them, a cruel evolutionary laboratory. Geographic isolation and brutal, grinding cold went to work on them like a sculptor with a chisel. Natural selection did not ask politely. The weak died. Those whose bodies could not hold heat died. What survived and bred and survived again was slowly hammered into something new. Not just a different kind of human, a biological fortress, and their empire was vast. At their peak, Neanderthals ranged from the Atlantic coast of Portugal, across the frozen mountains of Central Europe, down through the Middle East, all the way to the Altai Mountains of Siberia. A colossal stretch of the planet, varied, beautiful, and utterly deadly. And they did not just visit it, they held it. For something like 300,000 years, Neanderthals lived and hunted and buried their dead across that range. A longer, more successful run than our own species has managed so far. Let that sink in. Before you call something a failed experiment, remember it lasted many times longer than everything from the first cave painting to the phone in your hand. Now look at what the ice built. They were not tall. On average, they stood shorter than we do. But do not confuse height with weakness. That is a modern man's mistake. In biology, the cold has an iron rule. To survive it, you must be compact. And the Neanderthal was the living embodiment of that rule. Take a human skeleton in your mind. Now make every bone nearly twice as thick. Widen the joints, curve the leg bones to carry an enormous load of muscle. Their chest was not flat like ours. It flared out like a barrel, a wide cone of ribs built around a pair of massive lungs. Why? Because they needed oxygen, and a great deal of it. A Neanderthal's daily life was closer to a high-intensity marathon that never quite stopped, the body burning fuel constantly to hunt, to haul, and above all, to stay warm. And the face told the same story. In the center of it sat a broad, jutting nose, not for looks, but for survival. That nose warmed and moistened the freezing, bone-dry air of the Ice Age before it ever reached those sensitive lungs. Above the eyes ran the famous heavy brow, a thick ridge of bone. It shielded the eyes, yes, but it also anchored the muscles of a truly formidable jaw. How formidable? Scientists have run their skulls through computer models, and the results are sobering. Their bite was powerful enough to rival animals we would never dare to wrestle today. a grip built to tear through frozen meat and thick hide with no knife at all. Look at the arms and hands, and the picture gets even more intense. The bones are scarred with the marks of enormous muscle attachments. Their grip could likely crush what ours can only hold. Their forearms and shins were shorter than ours, not a flaw, but heat-saving engineering, keeping the warm blood close to the core. Everything about the body was tuned to one purpose: to generate power and to refuse to let go of its own heat. They were quite simply built for a fight. A Neanderthal could absorb impacts that would snap the bones of a modern man without much effort. Blows from panicked prey, from predators, from the punishing land itself. In fact, the pattern of healed injuries on their skeletons looks less like early farmers and more like something we will come back to later. The broken, rebuilt bodies of people who closed with enormous animals for a living. And none of this is guesswork or exaggeration. It is written in the bones. The fossils first pulled from the Neander Valley in Germany back in 1856. The very discovery that gave them their name put their raw physical power beyond any serious doubt. But here is the twist. All that brute strength was hiding a far bigger secret, because the real mystery of the Neanderthal was never in the muscle. It was inside the skull. And what modern science has finally found in there has forced us to tear up almost everything we thought we knew. For a long time, we assumed the Neanderthal skull held a small, simple brain. We were wrong, flatly, provably wrong. On average, the Neanderthal brain was actually larger than our own. So sit with the paradox again. Bigger brains, stronger bodies, and yet we are the ones still walking around, and they are the ones in the display case. How? The answer may not be in the size of the brain, but in the wiring of it. Our brains, it seems, evolved to pour their resources into one set of things: dense social networks, complex language, abstraction, imagining futures that do not exist yet. The Neanderthal brain spent its budget somewhere else. It invested heavily in vision and in control of the body. The back of their skull, where the visual centers sit, was massive. Their eyes were large, tuned to catch every last scrap of light in the gloom of endless polar winters and the black of deep caves. They may have seen the world with a sharpness, a clarity that you and I can barely imagine. They were creatures of the here and now, focused, alert, reacting to a lethal world in real time, faster than thought. For their world, they were not a rough draft at all. They were the finished masterpiece, the peak of human evolution, carved by the ice, for the ice. But hold on to that one difference: big visual brains and smaller circuitry for the social world. It looks like nothing here. By the end of this story, it may turn out to be everything, but nature is fickle, and the world that built them was about to turn on them. To feel the pressure they lived under, you have to picture the Ice Age itself. At its worst, the polar cap crawled down from the Arctic and crushed the continent. Where Berlin and London stand today, there were walls of ice kilometers high. But the real struggle was not on the ice. It was on the edge of it, a place called the Mammoth Steppe, a vast, howling ocean of dry grass, dust and wind, running all the way from Spain to Siberia. It was a land of brutal extremes. In summer, a sun that barely set. In the depths of winter, a darkness that could last for months. Ask yourself honestly, how do you survive a night that lasts half a year? How do you hold on to your own mind when the entire world is a frozen shadow? The answer begins with something they did not merely use, but mastered, a chemistry it would take our own species thousands of years to rediscover. Fire. For a long time, science assumed Neanderthals only borrowed fire, that they waited for lightning to strike a tree and then guarded the embers, slaves to luck. And just as we were once certain the Earth sat at the center of the universe, we were wrong about this too. Recent digs have revealed something startling. These people were chemists and geologists by instinct. They sought out specific minerals, like manganese dioxide, because they had worked out that its powder made wood catch and burn more easily. They struck stone against stone to throw sparks. They made fire, on demand, on purpose. And in the middle of that frozen abyss, the fire was not just a stove or a heater. It was the center of their entire universe. It was their television, their internet, and their library. It pushed back the nightmares circling in the dark. It turned tough, raw meat into fuel the body could actually use. But the most important thing the fire gave them was time. While other creatures slept the moment the sun went down, the Neanderthals stole back 4 or 5 extra hours of life every single day. Hours to mend their tools, and hours to sit close and look one another in the eyes and build the bonds that kept them from going mad in all that white silence. Let me stop here for a moment, because if you are still sitting by this fire with me, this deep into their story, then you already know what this channel is for. Every single day, we take the version of the past you were handed, the cartoon, the caricature, and we hold it up against the real evidence and watch it fall apart. If that is your kind of thing, subscribe and stay close. The people who last here are the ones who would rather have the true, complicated story than the comfortable one. Now, the fire saved them at night, but fire cannot come with you when you leave the cave to hunt. And out there, the temperature could crash to 30, 40, even 50 degrees below zero. Bare human skin freezes in minutes. So how exactly did they ever step outside? Turning an animal's skin into clothing is not as simple as pulling on a coat. It is a battle against biology. Raw hide rots and it stinks. Let it dry on its own, and it turns as stiff as a plank of wood. To wear it, you first have to break it, soften it, work it, until it becomes something a body can actually move in. So the Neanderthals built an entire industry around it. They scraped the fat and flesh away with sharp stone flakes. But to soften the leather enough to hunt in, they needed a tool that stone could not provide. And what they reached for is one of the most haunting details in all of prehistory. They used their own mouths. Look at Neanderthal fossils and you find something strange. The front teeth are worn down, brutally, far more than the back ones. They gripped the hide in their teeth and pulled, a living vice, while their hands stretched the fibers. Hour after hour, day after day, they ground their own teeth toward the roots to turn the skin of a bison into a coat that would keep a child alive. Because at the peak of winter, 90% of the body had to be covered. Without that sacrifice, the whole species would have frozen at the first hard night. And keep one detail in your back pocket for later. As best we can tell, they wrapped and lashed these hides rather than tailoring them with fine needles. It kept them alive. But it was not quite the snug, sealed, sewn clothing that another kind of human would one day carry into their world. Now picture the full weight of their existence, a place where the wind cuts skin like a razor, where the night lasts for months, where every single meal has to be won in hand-to-hand combat with an animal the size of a truck. They did not just endure that, they thrived in it. But how? How do you live in a frozen hell with no central heating, no synthetic clothes, no supermarket down the road? Part of the answer is that they refused to let the landscape decide where they could live. They learned to turn death itself into shelter. Forget the cartoon caveman sitting at the mouth of his cave watching the rain. Yes, they loved caves. Who wouldn't want a ready-made fortress of stone? But a cave has one fatal flaw. It cannot move, and the food moves. The great herds migrated across the steppe, and the Neanderthals had to follow. So what do you do when the cave is far behind you, and you are standing in the middle of an open plain with nothing but howling wind and no shelter in sight? You build your own mountain. In Ukraine, at a site called Moldova, archaeologists found something that quietly rewrote the story: rings of enormous bones. The Neanderthals had hunted mammoths, stripped the meat, and then used the carcass itself as building material. Skulls, jawbones, and long curved tusks stacked into deliberate patterns and draped with heavy hides to seal out the cold. A single mammoth skull can weigh more than a grown man, so assembling a ring of them was itself a feat of raw strength and cold planning. These were not random heaps. They were planned structures, homes built from the bodies of the giants they had killed. And inside them, the wind could scream all it wanted. The Neanderthal did not huddle and shiver like cornered prey. He owned that space. So they beat the climate. They survived a world that should have scrubbed any creature out of Africa clean off the map. But the cold always sends a bill, and it is paid in calories. Keeping a body like that alive in that kind of cold took a staggering amount of fuel. A modern human gets by on roughly 2,000 to 2,500 calories a day. A Neanderthal needed something closer to double, as much as 5,000 calories every single day. And there were no farms, no granaries, no stockpiles saved up for a bad month, no margin for error at all. There was only a wooden spear, a handful of stone tools, and animals the size of a bus that had absolutely no intention of dying. 5,000 calories a day is not a diet. It is a standing emergency, one that reset itself every single dawn. They had conquered the cold, but now they faced an enemy even more relentless: hunger. And to beat it, they would have to do something that sounds close to madness. Walk straight up to the largest, most dangerous animals on the planet and decide that those animals were dinner. For a Neanderthal, finding 5,000 calories was not shopping. It was declaring war every single day. They had no bows, no arrows. There was no such thing as a safe distance. To eat, you had to close the gap, to step inside the personal space of an animal that could weigh as much as a truck, sometimes 5 tons. So how did they do that over and over without simply being wiped out? The answer is not in the muscle, it is in the engineering. To you and me, a rock on the ground is just a rock. To a Neanderthal, it was a weapon that had not woken up yet. For a long time, we told ourselves their tools were crude: a sharp edge, a lucky bash. Wrong again. They had mastered something called the Levallois technique. Think of it as 3-dimensional chess played in stone. Before the very first blow, the toolmaker could already see the finished blade hidden inside the raw flint. Every strike after that was calculated. The core was shaped and prepared with care, and then, one clean, decisive hit, a blade fell away. Thin, symmetrical, sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. But a blade in your hand is merely dangerous. A blade on the end of a shaft is lethal. And here they did something we genuinely did not expect. They invented the first synthetic glue in history. By heating the bark of the birch tree in a sealed, oxygen-starved fire, they produced a black, sticky tar. It sounds simple, but it is real chemistry. A controlled process that modern researchers had to work hard to reproduce. With that tar, in cords of animal sinew, they bound the stone blade tightly to a wooden shaft. What they made was not a light javelin to throw, it was a heavy thrusting spear, a bayonet. Why? Because they were not hunting to wound their prey. They were hunting to take it down, up close, where the real work was. Picture the hunt. The wind blows into the hunters' faces, carrying their scent away. They do not chase. Chasing burns calories they cannot spare. They wait, silent, patient as stone. And when the animal drifts too close, the ambush detonates. One group breaks cover, screaming, shoving, forcing the beast to turn in panic. The others drive in from the flank and push those heavy blades through hide and fat, reaching for the organs underneath. And in that moment, death is standing on both sides of the spear. You can read the cost of it right off their skeletons. Broken arms, snapped ribs, cracked skulls, healed over. There is one group of people alive today whose injuries look startlingly similar. Rodeo riders. The men who climb onto 2,000 pounds of furious muscle and try to hang on. A Neanderthal's entire life was that rodeo, over and over, with no bell to end the round. And think about what was actually on the menu. Woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, wild horse, bison, the giant aurochs, an ancestor of cattle that stood taller than a man at the shoulder. These were not deer you pick off from a hilltop. Any one of them could kill an entire hunting party in a few seconds of panic. There was no safe version of this. The only real choice was whether you ate or you didn't. But when they won, the payoff was enormous. They sat at the very top of the Ice Age food chain. Chemical analysis of their bones shows they ate meat on the level of wolves and lions, true apex predators. The rich fat of the big grazers was the perfect fuel for those demanding bodies and hungry brains. And yet, they were not just meat machines. When scientists scraped the hardened plaque off their fossil teeth, they found something nobody expected. Grains of starch, traces of cooked plants, tubers, nuts, even mushrooms. They gathered and they cooked. Some of them carried bitter herbs like chamomile and yarrow. Plants with almost no food value, but real power against pain and swelling. They were, in other words, using medicine, and they did not live off the land alone. In the caves of Gibraltar, we find the bones of seals, of shellfish, even of dolphins. They read the tides. They took whatever the world put within their reach, and they wasted nothing. They had beaten the cold. They had beaten the hunger. By every measure of survival, they were winning. But surviving today has never once guaranteed you a tomorrow. And the deepest threats to the Neanderthals were not out on the steppe at all. They were closer to home, in the body of a mother giving birth, and in the slow-growing emptiness of their own silent world. Every threat we have talked about so far has been out there, in the cold, in the teeth of a mammoth. But the most dangerous moment in a Neanderthal life happened in the dark of the shelter, and it happened to a woman. Childbirth has always been dangerous for our kind. For a Neanderthal mother, it was close to a biomechanical nightmare. Her body was powerful, her hips were wide, but the babies were big, and above all, they had large heads, packed with those fast-growing brains. Even with a pelvis shaped a little differently from ours, the passage was narrow and brutal. A baby that got stuck meant two deaths, not one, the child and the mother. In a world with no hospitals, no surgeons, no second chances, she could not do it alone. And here the fossils and the anatomy tell us something quietly astonishing. For the first time anywhere in the human story, we see real evidence of assisted birth. Other women, relatives, quite possibly the father, hands reaching in to help. Birth was not something you survived by yourself in a corner. It was a shared act, a group holding one of its own through the worst hour of her life. The very first cry of a Neanderthal baby was answered by other hands, ready to catch it. But that closeness points straight at their deepest weakness: isolation. Their world was, above all, empty. A single Neanderthal could live an entire lifetime and never meet a soul from outside their own small band. We can actually measure it now. Genetic studies of a group found at El Cidrón in Spain reveal families with shockingly low genetic diversity. They were inbreeding, not out of desire, but out of sheer lack of anyone else. There were simply not enough of them, spread too thin across too much frozen ground. Imagine that kind of loneliness. A whole life, and the only human faces you ever know are the handful you were born beside. In a world that's small, other people are not rivals to compete with. They are the only warmth there is. And that scarcity changed what a single human being was worth. When your entire world is a dozen faces, losing one is not just losing a pair of hands. It is losing an irreplaceable piece of everything you are. Which brings us to a cave in Iraq called Shanidar, and to the man who may be the final proof that these people had souls. Archaeologists gave him a nickname, Nandi. He was old for his time, maybe 45, maybe 50, and his skeleton is a catalog of catastrophe. A crushing blow to the face had blinded him in one eye and likely damaged his brain, leaving one side of his body partly paralyzed. His right arm was withered and useless. In fact, it had been lost above the elbow, and the stump had fully healed. He limped on a ruined leg. His teeth were ground down to the roots. By the cold arithmetic of survival, this man should not have existed. Nandi could not hunt. He could not run from a predator. He could not carry a load and could barely chew his own food. In brutal, practical terms, he took from the group and gave almost nothing material back. He should have been left behind decades before he actually died, but he was not left behind. He lived, and he lived a long, long time in that broken body. And there is only one way that is possible. Someone fed him. Someone sheltered him. Someone guarded a half-blind, half-paralyzed, one-armed man from the hyenas and the bears, year after year, perhaps for decades. Why would they? Because he mattered to them. Because he carried their stories, their memory, their hard-won knowledge of the land. Shanidar is the evidence that compassion did not arrive with cities, or writing, or religion. It was already here, deep in the ice, tens of thousands of years ago. They buried their dead, and in at least one famous grave, clumps of ancient pollen were found around the body, which some have read as flowers laid down with the dead. Others think the wind or burrowing animals carried it there, and we should be honest that the debate is real. But strip the argument away, and this much stands. They loved, they grieved, they protected their own with a loyalty most of us would recognize in a heartbeat. And yet, all the tenderness in the world, inside that shelter, did nothing to soften the world waiting outside it. Because the Neanderthals ruled the North, but they never ruled it alone. They shared it with giants that shrugged off their spears and did not see them as rivals at all. They saw them as meat. We like to believe we sit at the top of the food chain. Walk into a forest today, and your fear is not being eaten. It is getting lost or twisting an ankle. The Neanderthal never had that luxury. They were superb predators. But they were not the only predators, and they were very far from the biggest. Step out of the cave, and you stepped into a world where nearly everything was larger, stronger, and hungrier than anything alive today. At night, there was a sound that turned the blood to ice. The cave hyena. Forget the hyenas you picture on a savanna. These weighed over 100 kilograms, they hunted in organized packs, and they did not wait politely for something else to die. We have found Neanderthal bones scarred with deep tooth marks and etched by stomach acid. Some Neanderthals were never buried by their families at all. They were eaten. To a pack of cave hyenas, these mighty hunters were not lords of the North. They were simply a meal that happened to fight back. And the worst danger was not always out on the plain. Sometimes it was waiting inside the shelter. Picture trudging back to your cave through the snow, half frozen. You step inside, you raise your torch, and you realize you are not alone. The cave bear, rearing up on its hind legs, stood well over 3 meters tall, a wall of muscle, claws, and fury. Bear and Neanderthal wanted the exact same thing, a dry cave to outlast the winter, and there was no sharing it. The fight happened in the dark, in a closed space, with no way out. Sometimes the bear won, sometimes, incredibly, the Neanderthal won. And this was not some rare, once-in-a-lifetime horror. It was routine, a constant, grinding war for shelter itself. Every healed break in their bones, every scar, was a receipt for another day survived. They lived at the absolute outer limit of what a body can take, and they did it successfully for hundreds of thousands of years. And then, somewhere around 45 to 50,000 years ago, something new appeared on the horizon. It was not a monster. It had no great claws, no saber teeth. From a distance, it looked unsettlingly familiar. It walked on 2 legs, it wore skins, it carried spears. But as it came closer, something felt strange and hard to name. These newcomers were taller, leaner. Their skin was darker, shaped by a distant African sun. Their faces were flat, their foreheads high and vertical, and they moved with an odd, gliding lightness, spending less energy with every step. It was us, Homo sapiens, walking at last into their world. So how did that first meeting go? For a long time, we loved to tell a simple, dramatic story. A war of extermination. Superior humans pouring into Europe and butchering the Neanderthals in one long, bloody campaign. A prehistoric genocide. It makes a great movie. But the evidence just is not there. There are no great battlefields. No fields of Neanderthal bones run through with our spear points. No sign of a total war at all. The real clash was not between armies. It was between glances. Picture a band of Neanderthals watching from a ridgeline as down in the valley, these strange, lean figures move through the grass. Fear and curiosity, probably at the very same time. Because we brought things they had never seen. Spear throwers that let us kill from a safe distance. No need to grapple the mammoth up close. Fine bone needles for tight, tailored, sealed clothing, beads and ornaments, musical instruments, symbols. We were more numerous, louder, woven into far larger networks that traded goods and news across enormous distances. And we were the invaders. Here's the quiet, terrible truth of it. We did not need to kill the Neanderthals to defeat them. We only had to want what they had. Every herd our hunters brought down was food taken out of their mouths. Every good cave we settled pushed them a little higher, a little colder, a little closer to the edge. It was not a war. It was a slow suffocation. And yet, it was not only conflict. There were meetings, glances traded across a river that did not end in violence. And sometimes there was far more than a glance. We know this now beyond any doubt, because the proof is written inside your own body. Neanderthals and sapiens came together. Children were born from it, and a piece of them survived hidden all the way down to you. So here we are, back at the question we started with. If they were stronger than us, and their brains were as big or bigger, why is the planet crawling with billions of Homo sapiens, while the last Neanderthal died alone in a cave on the Rock of Gibraltar, around 40,000 years ago? The honest answer is not the one that makes a good action film. There was no last stand, no final battle. Their end did not come with a bang. It came as a slow, silent fade. They were not beaten by monsters, and they were not wiped out in a war with us. They were beaten by things you cannot see coming: numbers, genetics, climate. Remember how few of them there were, and how thinly they were spread. Those small, inbred bands with almost no fresh blood coming in. Now drop them into a climate that was lurching and flipping, growing more unstable by the century. And into that fragile world, add a competitor that bred faster, gathered in larger groups, and spread across the land like water finding cracks. That was the real killer. Not our strength, their thin margins. When you live with no surplus, no spare people, no room for error, you can be magnificent and still lose. One bad generation, one collapsed herd, one winner too many, and suddenly there are not enough of you left to ever come back. Remember that difference we flagged long ago? Their big, brilliant brains wired for vision and the here and now, ours wired for wider webs of people. In the end, that may be the whole story. We were not stronger. We were simply more connected, and there were simply more of us. The clock ran down, the margin vanished, and without a single dramatic blow, an entire kind of human was quietly wiped from the earth. Except, and this is where the whole story turns over in your hands, they were not wiped out. Not completely, not really. Because here is something you can check against your own body. If you have any ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa, if you are European, Asian, Native American, Aboriginal Australian, then you are not 100% Homo sapiens. You are part Neanderthal. Somewhere between 1 and 4% of your DNA came directly from them. Sit with that. It means the story was never only a war. It was also an encounter, a coexistence, a blending. They did not just die out. They were taken in, absorbed, and across 1,000 generations their DNA was diluted, thinned, but it was never lost. It is still switched on inside you right now. The way your skin adapted to weak northern sun, parts of your immune system, still fighting off diseases with weapons they handed you. The way your body stores fat, even threads of how you sleep, how your mood turns, how you feel pain. Some of that traces straight back to them. And those inherited genes were not trivia, they were survival gear. They are part of what let our own ancestors walk out of Africa and endure the cold, the sickness, and the strangeness of a whole new world. So think about what that actually means. There are 8 billion of us now, and scattered through those 8 billion people, in tiny fragments, there is more surviving Neanderthal DNA walking the earth today than in all the ice ages they ever lived through. In the strangest way imaginable, they are more alive now than they ever were then. They were not a failed experiment. They were not the dim brutes of the old cartoons. They were the strongest humans who ever lived. And when their world finally closed in around them, they did not simply vanish into the dark. They stepped into us. They are still here, behind your eyes, in your blood, in the parts of you that are tougher than you will ever have to know. If you made it this far, you already know this isn't the kind of channel that's going anywhere. We put out something like this every single day, the version of the story that survives contact with the actual evidence. Subscribing keeps you in that loop. And if this one stayed with you, send it to 5 people who'd sit through something this long with you. Not everyone will. Some people do. Leave a comment, a real one. Tell me what part of this actually surprised you, and tell me what civilization, what forgotten site, what quiet piece of hidden history you want us to look at next. We'll be here tomorrow, still digging.